Number 5. The Lighthouse. From visionary director Robert Eggers comes The Lighthouse, a harrowing fable that teaches us the importance of respecting personal boundaries and respecting seabirds. Eggers is one of my favorite modern horror directors, whose work sits a cut above the most usual horror fare with The Witch, The Lighthouse, and The Northman, which isn't quite horror unless you're terrified of Norway. The Lighthouse is unlike any other scary movies you've seen. Actually, it's probably unlike most movies you've seen. It's kinda hard to define The Lighthouse under one genre. It's unsettling and definitely makes me feel all heebly-jeebly watching it, but it isn't horror in the traditional sense. There's no monsters or slashers, just two men, a lighthouse, a whole lot of seagulls, and enough cabin fever-induced madness to shake a lobster at. A rookie lighthouse keeper, played by Robert Pattinson, is assigned to keep a lighthouse on a small isolated island off the coast of New England, under the supervision of the island's crusty old master, Willem Dafoe. Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson are some of the best working actors out there right now, and the two of these titans absolutely show up for this, carrying this two-headed character piece on their backs and speaking in some of the most hilariously memorable accents ever put to film. Seriously, Willem Dafoe's old nautical piratical accent in this thing needs to be taught in acting schools. I would do an impression, but I won't do it justice. The film is shot beautifully, the whole thing seeming like a mix between a bad dream and an avant-garde theater production, leaving you asking the entire time if anything you're seeing can be trusted, if any of it's even happening, or if the whole thing is all just one twisted nightmare between two very lonely, isolated men. Now, I can't say for sure if they went nuts because they weren't subscribed to Top 5 Scary, but I'm willing to bet that a little bit of entertainment from the best scary videos channel on the web might have helped some of that madness. So subscribe, maybe.
Swinging in at number 4, Rebecca, 1940.
You've nothing to live for, really, have you? Look down there. It's easy, isn't it? Why don't you?
A film which, for all intents and purposes, wasn't exactly Hitchcock 101, but instead a frighteningly different foray into a burgeoning facet of his potency as a filmmaker. You see, it goes without saying, but Hitchcock first cut his teeth in his native Britain as a silent filmmaker, carving out a new path for the horror and thriller genre. Eventually though, with success soon came international acclaim, and that caused Hollywood to take note. As they do. Rebecca, for the sum of its parts, was Hitchcock's first American film, and it does stand out because of that. In many ways, Rebecca is an island in Hitchcock's work, standing on its own significance, and that perhaps is the reason why it was so impactful. For all intents and purposes, Rebecca is a gothic horror. It is a brooding film, deeply psychological, haunting in many ways that modern cinema struggles to capture. It's grandiose at all the right notes, and it paints itself as a ghost story without a ghost. But hey, that's Hitchcock, right? Based upon the Daphne du Maurier novel of the same name written in 1938, Rebecca typifies the role of the malevolent housekeeper, a classic staple of gothic horror, and the vessel in which this film goes from being just a drama to a deeply unsettling psychological thriller. From a narrative perspective, this film was way ahead of its time, and although it encapsulates the plot of du Maurier's novel, Hitchcock's handle of the cinematic lens took it to the next level. It tells the tale of a young woman played by Joan Fontaine who, although is never named in both the book and the film, falls in love with a aristocratic widower, a man named Maxim de Winter, played by the one and only Laurence Olivier. The pair marry and he soon takes her back to Manderley, his extravagant mansion by the sea, and there we meet his housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers. And there we have Rebecca. Listen, although the stars of this film, Olivier and Fontaine, are remarkable in it, Rebecca is terrifying because of the performance of Judith Anderson, who plays Mrs. Danvers. She is impeccable in this movie. She is terrifying. She really is. Why is it called Rebecca? Well, watch the movie and find out. Next up at number 3, The Birds, 1963. Which, let's face it, you've all been waiting for, as it is in fact perhaps Hitchcock's most explicit horror. But it's also one of the strangest and most mysterious horror movies ever made. Which might sound like a bit of an overstatement, but hear me out. If you're asking me, The Birds is more cosmic horror than anything else. It's the definition of the unknown. It's a small town that seemingly gets savagely attacked by a swarm of crows, seagulls and sparrows. Why? We don't know. In fact, Hitchcock made a point of it to never tell us or explain the matter. He was deliberately ambiguous. In fact, he invited the audience to theorize as to why these birds are savagely attacking the poor townspeople, and then gave no answer. In some cases, he outright refused to answer. A virus? Nope. Mad bird disease? No. Now, for those of you that haven't seen the film, you might be thinking, birds? Really? Scary? But please, this is Hitchcock we're talking about. The man can make a bouquet of flowers scary. Again, based upon the resounding 1952 novella of the same name by Daphne du Maurier again, The Birds tells a tale of Melanie Daniels, a young socialite who falls smitten with a lawyer named Mitch in a chance encounter at a pet store, and shortly takes a trip with him to his quaint coastal Californian town of Vertigo Bay. After a romantic excursion, Melanie strangely gets attacked and badly injured by a seagull. That strikes her as odd, but as soon as the days go by, more and more birds seem to be converging over the town, standing in lines on unassuming fences, covering children's playgrounds, flocking on people's roofs, and then we have the birds. It's simple, it's effective, and it's genuinely terrifying. A little side note, my nan actually showed me this film when I was about 6 years old, and although it was the middle of the day, I was completely and utterly horrified. Hey, maybe that's why it's instilled in me a passion for horror fiction. Thanks, Nan. And thank you, Hitchcock. Coming in at number 2, Vertigo, 1958. Pound for pound, I'd say this is Hitchcock's best movie. Obviously, it's a tough one to call, but the convergence of every theme he ever laid out on screen seems to find its place in the frames of 1958's Vertigo. First and foremost, this film is beautiful. And not only is it beautiful, but from a technical perspective, it was way ahead of its time. Now, I know it's easy to sometimes get wrapped up in the ostentatious nature of the grass being greener way back when, but forget about the sycophants of cinema. This film is truly a masterpiece, and much like the more contemporary classics of horror cinema, it's in repeat viewings where Vertigo truly shines. It's a film that encompasses so much that it's impossible to take it all in one sitting. It's a vertigo of the mind almost. It's a false sense of rotational movement, something not quite right about a frame or a certain sequence that jars you. Horror cinema can do that, and Hitchcock did that. A film can have a physical effect. That's maybe not a weird thought now, but in 1958, the man was a sorcerer. Based upon the 1954 French crime novel From Along the Dead by Bourlet Narcajac, Vertigo stars the remarkable James Stewart as a former police detective, Scotty Ferguson, who is forced into an early retirement following a traumatic incident in the line of duty, which inflicted Scotty with a severe fear of heights, as well as vertigo, a dizzying sensation of whirling and a loss of balance. I mean, the clinical definition of vertigo kind of already sums up this film, but yeah, you get the point. As the film slowly unravels itself, Scotty is hired by an old college acquaintance, a private investigator who suspects his wife of infidelity after she's been acting strangely, and from there, we have it. Now, there are so many twists and turns when it comes to this movie, many of them visually as well as narratively, and it's a disorientating experience to sit through. Really, it is. It's dizzying. The heights of this film are lofty, and the implications of every frame run so damn deep that we could probably do an entire video on it. Vertigo, guys, is the best. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, Psycho, 1960.
Do you go out with friends?
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
Because the truth of the matter is, I'd usually reserve this position for something that was perhaps a little bit off the wall, you know? Something that isn't quite expected, something that doesn't find its way to the top of everyone else's list, because that's boring, right? You guys want something fresh, you want a movie that you've never heard of, you want something new. But guys, this is a list about Alfred Hitchcock's scariest films, and there is no doubting that 1960's Psycho is unequivocal. There is nothing that even comes close to it. Psycho is the scariest film that he ever made. Period. No question. Not only is it the scariest film that he ever made, it's also one of the scariest films ever made. I mean, really, it is. Psycho is horrifying. I mean, just watch this. The slow pacing of the door's shadow, the shift of focus as Arbogast takes each step up the staircase, the inverted aerial shot of an indoor space. Wait, what's that? Why is that? And then jarring, jagged violins, and then Mother. Bernard Herrmann's music in that scene, as well as the entire movie, is second to none. I mean, for me, that is one of the scariest scenes in the entire film, and that's saying something. Although the shower scene gets all of the love, and it deserves it, because what the hell, this film is pretty much near perfection, and we don't have to pick and choose between some of the greatest scenes in horror cinema, because we can just watch the movie and see them all unfold before our very eyes. We can just sit down and witness the master at work. Psycho. That's all there is to it. Kicking off at number 5, Session 9, 2001.
I know this is difficult, Mary, and that's why we're here to help, okay?
I miss Peter.
And for a list that is filled to the brim with some of the most monumental works of horror cinema, a few of you may stand aghast at me placing 2001's Session 9 on this list, but I'd say that's exactly the point. If you've ever heard about how good Session 9 is, particularly when it comes to psychological horror, but never had the gumption to go out and watch it, consider this your warning sign. Session 9 is a fantastic horror film, and as so far as psychological horror goes, it's up there with some of the best of the best. Now, I'm a bit of a stickler for tying things off in neat little packages, and believe me when I say this, Session 9 has one of the best final lines of dialogue in the whole of horror cinema. Obviously, no spoilers, but yeah, it's good. Now, whilst we've covered Session 9 quite a few times over here at Top 5 Scary Videos, I appreciate that not everyone has had the pleasure of seeing it, so let's see what all the fuss is about. Written and directed by Brad Anderson, the man responsible for 2004's The Machinist, which is also a fantastic psychological thriller that falls slightly outside the realm of horror, Session 9 was a complete flop at the box office, but hey, that's the reason why we can now adore it from a distance. Session 9 tells a tale of Gordon, the grizzled old owner of an asbestos removal company, who takes a desperate bid to clear out Danvers State Hospital, an abandoned mental institution, and we all know how that usually goes, right? Well, the thing is, whilst on the surface Session 9 seems to be a relatively standard staple of horror, this film is so damn surprising in its delivery that not only is it genuinely terrifying, it's also a joy to watch something so fresh that also covers some incredibly important themes. Peter Mullen, who plays Gordon in this film, also knocks Session 9 out of the park. He's fantastic, and the weight of his performance really turns up the slow claustrophobic descent into chaos. I'll say no more because there are spoilers abound for Session 9, but yeah, it truly deserves its place here.
Number 4, Annihilation. I've talked a bit about Annihilation before on this channel, and I will continue to do so until Annihilation gets the respect it deserves. That's my mission. I've never forgiven the movie-going populace for not seeing this one in theaters. Annihilation came to us from director and writer Alex Garland, who also gave us Ex Machina, a fantastic movie about having a crush on a robot. Annihilation is a cosmic horror story detailing the effects of after an asteroid crashes to Earth and a mysterious alien presence known as the Shimmer begins to manifest across a quarantine zone in a forest outside an army base. Everything the Shimmer touches starts to blend together. Biological life merging, double helixes swirling in a big cosmic gumbo. The film is hauntingly beautiful as it is terrifying. Our protagonist Lena, played by Natalie Portman, is a US Army veteran who lost her husband in an unrelated combat mission. One day he shows up on her doorstep, convulsing violently, leading Lena towards the Shimmer. Learning her husband was involved, she ventures forth with a group of fellow researchers and soldiers to uncover what lies at the heart of the Shimmer, what's causing it, and if it can be stopped. The film is a visual treat with its lush vistas and uniquely terrifying monster designs. I've talked about Annihilation Bear before, and I will take any opportunity to talk about Annihilation Bear. I love Annihilation Bear. Slap a photo of him back there for me. Annihilation is the perfect kind of horror movie, simultaneously exploring complex themes of depression, grief, humanity's inherent nature and propensity towards self-destructive behavior, but it also asks even bigger questions like, wouldn't it be really yucky if a bear had a human skull inside its head that screamed like a dying human while it was roaring? Get you a horror movie that can do both, okay? Number 3, Jacob's Ladder. While the first 2 entries on our list were pretty recent and well received, I want to throw it back a couple decades for our next entry and highlight a cult classic that could always use a little bit more love. Jacob's Ladder details the story of Jacob Singer, a Vietnam veteran who 4 years later, after returning home from the war, struggles to readjust to his normal life. Not helping matters much, no doubt, is the fact that Jacob keeps seeing horrifying monstrosities surrounding him every day. It seems as if since he's come home, nothing has ever been the same. The film shows us life through Jacob's tormented eyes. As he tries to navigate through healing and overcoming his personal demons, he is constantly haunted by real-life demons that seem to have a very vested interest in him. Matters only serve to get a lot more confusing when Jacob learns that other members of his platoon, back from his army days, have all been suffering similar things, reporting seeing the same monsters and being haunted. Desperate to find the truth, Jacob seeks out the cause of what's happening to him and his old friends, and ends up descending down a path of madness, learning things no man ever should. Worth noting is just how influential Jacob's Ladder is, serving as one of the direct inspirations for the legendary Silent Hill series of games, with Silent Hill 2 in particular taking major inspiration from the film's plotline, monsters, twists, right down to the protagonists even wearing the exact same outfit as a little homage. Jacob's Ladder is a little older than some of the other entries on this list. It is absolutely worth a watch and still worth your time. A great performance out of Tim Robbins and one of the most wild twist ending horror movies ever had. A bunch have tried to copy this. I'm sure you've seen a million hack writers copy it, but no one did it as cool as when Jacob's Ladder did it, so there. And actually thinking about it, I shouldn't even mention a twist, so There was no twist. Everything in Jacob's Ladder happens very literally. Go into it knowing that, okay? Number 2, Sinister. Moving. It's always stressful, isn't it? It's a huge pain. Well, Sinister is a 2012 horror film about an everyday family moving houses and all the trials and tribulations that come with that, like having to update your postal code on your information, unpacking your stuff and figuring out where all your art books are gonna go, and finding out that you moved into a house where a series of grisly rituals happened, sacrificing the previous family who lived here, and it's all been filmed and kept in a box upstairs in the attic. You know, just regular stuff the kids go through all the time. A struggling true crime novelist is trying to chase his glory days and intentionally moves into a house he knows where ghastly deaths took place in order to get close to the story so he can better research it and write a bestseller. He discovers a box in the attic full of film of all of the crimes and becomes obsessed with uncovering and exposing what happened, mostly so he can make a quick buck and get himself back on top again and make the late night circuit. As his obsession grows, it starts to affect his family and children in concerning ways, as everyone in the family starts acting stranger, having visions, hallucinations, and psychotic episodes, leaving you wondering if there is something much deeper going on in this house beyond a floundering author chasing a bestseller. Now, if you haven't seen this one, it's definitely worth going into this one as blind as you possibly can, because the twists and turns totally make this one. I spent the entire runtime of this propped up on the edge of the couch, my heart pounding, hoping that everything would turn out to be totally okay, even though I knew better. It's a horror movie, things never go great. The movie's got a stellar sense of dread that refuses to let go once it starts, and only lets you breathe out once the credits roll, and even then, not for very long. Fantastic performances across the board, but a special shout out goes to Ethan Hawke, who makes this thing. Number 1, Hereditary. Now, there are a ton of movies that could easily have taken the number 1 spot here, and I thought pretty hard about making The Shining number 1, since, you know, it's kind of a classic, but I figured a lot of people have talked about The Shining, and then I remembered the experience of seeing Hereditary in a movie theater, and how it was the only time in my life I've ever seriously thought about leaving a movie theater because I thought I was gonna throw up on the seats. I was so scared and uncomfortable. Hereditary is a 2018 horror movie from visionary Ari Aster, who also gave us the psychological horror movie masterpiece Midsommar, so Aster really just bangs out the hits. Hereditary is about as peak A24 horror movie as it gets. One of those ones where the monster is really a metaphor for generational trauma and all that. After the grand matriarch of a Midwestern family passes away, her daughter and grandkids begin to uncover the cryptic and terrifying truth behind their ancestry, trying desperately to escape the sinister legacy they've inadvertently inherited. This movie is terrifying in the worst of ways. It's not just jump scares or tons of blood. No. This is elevated horror. This is not your usual horror story. It really zeroes in on the way too close to home horror of watching a family break apart. It is gut-wrenchingly painful to watch, preying on really specific kind of fears. It's gonna get its hooks in you and have your teeth grinding for the full 2 hours runtime and for ages afterwards. If you've seen this, I dare you to look at a pigeon, a stop sign, cheese wire, or a treehouse ever the same after this movie. And staggering performances. Toni Collette goes for absolute gold and delivers one of the best performances I've ever seen in a horror movie, full stop. She needs an Oscar for most upsetting crying I have ever heard in a film, which is a category she would have no competition in. Hereditary might not be the goriest film or even the scariest movie I've ever seen or most upsetting. There's a bunch of Takashi Miike or Park Chan-wook films that would probably take that. But Hereditary is definitely one of the most viscerally scary movies I've ever seen. The kind that just sits in your gut and makes you think about it all day, like you were living through an actual nightmare. Watch only if you're truly brave. I know I made it sound absolutely horrible, but it is a great movie. Just don't be surprised if you don't sleep that night.
Kicking off at number 5, Rear Window, 1954. And for the Simpsons fans amongst you, you may remember a certain Bart Simpson being in a very similar position. And whilst it's certainly true that being referenced by that show is an accolade in its own right, I'd say that yes, Hitchcock really was that influential. You see, it's easy to argue sometimes that the classics were only successful because no one had done it yet. And yeah, whilst that's correct for some of his contemporaries, Hitchcock really was in a league of his own. He was one of the few filmmakers to master single location movies, and in doing that it earned earned him the incredibly complex and detailed set that Rear Window is filmed on, an exquisitely crafted replica of one particularly iconic Greenwich Village courtyard. Again, when we talk about Hitchcock's horror here, we have to remember that suspense was the man's modus operandi, and this film is the literal definition of suspense. Based upon the 1942 short story It Had to Be Murdered by Cornell Woolrich, with a screenplay from John Michael Hayes, Rear Window tells a tale of a man named Jeff, a fantastic and adventurous photographer who has suffered a broken leg on his latest journey and so is wheelchair bound whilst he recovers in his Greenwich Village apartment. During this time, as the rear window of his apartment backs out into a busy and elaborate courtyard, Jeff slowly starts to learn about the intricate lives of his many neighbours. During a powerful heatwave, his neighbours have tended to keep their windows open to stay cool, but on one certain stormy evening, Jeff overhears a woman scream a blood-curdling scream, pleading for her life, and suddenly he discovers that there's a killer somewhere in the courtyard. Honestly, this film is actually brilliant, and for people trying to get into Hitchcock's work, I'd recommend this as a starting point. It's entirely accessible in its simplicity, but its execution is second to none. It's almost strange to be watching a genuinely gripping film to then get snapped back to reality to realise this film was made in 1954. Also, it stars James Stewart as Jeff, who is historically fantastic in this movie, and there's an absolutely knockout performance from the legendary Grace Kelly. It's Hitchcock 101. Swinging in at number 4, Misery, 1990.
Oh, you bought the wrong paper, Annie. I can't write on this paper, Annie. Well, I'll get your stupid paper, but you just better start showing me a little more appreciation around here, Mr. Man.
Oh, Annie Wilkes, you bought the wrong paper, Annie. You terrifying nurse of a person. A nurson. Sorry, I'm trying to distract myself, because really, if you've seen any of our previous Stephen King lists, you'll know the deep-seated fear I have for this character in particular. If only he got out of the cock-a-doodle car. Or, well, he probably should have stayed in it, in all reality, and waited for it to burst into flames, so he'd quickly be put out of his misery. Hey, would you look at that? We've come full circle. The point is, it goes without saying that 1990s Misery deserves its place here. And you might be thinking, number 4, wow, that's pretty low. But no, it's a testament to the rest of the entries on this list. But when it comes to psychological horror, you really have to go the distance. But that's not to detract from anything about Misery though, and if we're talking about performance alone, then there is perhaps no greater cinematic depiction of a psychopath. Yeah, Misery is nothing without Kathy Bates. They go together like Rama Lama Lama Cat Dinga Da Ding Da Dong. They're two peas in a pod, and whilst for the astute amongst you, I may have made that joke before, the point remains the same. Hey, I feel like I'm irking on psychological horror trying to describe this damn movie, which may be pretty illuminating to how horrific it is. Directed by Rob Reiner with a screenplay from none other than William Goldman, based upon the resounding 1987 Stephen King novel of the same name, Misery tells the tale of a renowned novelist, Paul Sheldon, fantastically portrayed by James Caan, who is caught in a blizzard whilst travelling back to New York one evening and then gets hurtled off the road in a horrifying car accident. Luckily for him though, he's rescued by a nurse, Annie Wilkes, who lives nearby and offers him shelter in her remote home. And luckily for him, it just so turns out that Annie Wilkes is his #1 fan. Yeah, I need to say any more about Misery, because if you haven't seen it or read it for that matter, stop what you're doing right this minute and get to it. Next up at number 3, Jacob's Ladder, 1990. Yeah, here we go. Jacob's Ladder, everybody, and believe me, that clip is on the tamer side of what's left to rear its ugly, horrifying, psychologically traumatizing head. In many ways, Jacob's Ladder is the living definition of psychological horror, and since its release back in 1990, it's stuck out like a sore thumb in the catalogue of horror. For the most part, there hasn't ever been a film made quite like Jacob's Ladder, and that's mainly down to Tim Robbins' absolutely mesmerizing performance as Jacob Singer, an American combat medic that has returned from the Vietnam War with a box of horrors of his own to deal with. The psychological implications of witnessing the horrors of the Vietnam War aside, what Jacob's Ladder manages to do is put us in the headspace of someone experiencing a descent into madness. And whilst that sounds like a relatively straightforward staple of horror, and it is, it's also really difficult to do well. Jacob's Ladder doesn't just do it well, it's perhaps the greatest cinematic depiction of one man's life spiraling out of control. This film is devastating, it's bleak, and for those of you that haven't yet seen it, I'll try my utmost to keep a lid on things. things. Written by Bruce Joel Rubin and directed by Adrian Lin, the man behind the fantastic 1987 thriller Fatal Attraction, Jacob's Ladder tells the tale of Jacob Singer, a US combat medic that is injured in the Vietnam War, where he returns to his native city of New York to attempt to live a normal life again after inexplicably grieving about the things that he's lost. As he deals with these emotions, Jacob begins to experience horrifying visions of a world desperately trying to consume him. Now, listen, the visuals in this film are something else entirely, and they go on to influence some of the greatest works of video game horror, as in the Silent Hill franchise, and that may be a little bit spoilerific, so I'll stop there. If you haven't yet seen Jacob's Ladder, it really is a movie deserving of its hype. It's harrowing, it's desperate, it's bleak. It's a film that you need to be hugged afterwards. It's emotionally draining, both on and off the screen. I'll say no more. Jacob's Ladder is one of the greatest psychological horror movies ever made. Coming in at number 2, Funny Games, 2007.
Cock it. Pull the hammer back.
And yes, I'm including both the 1997 and 2007 versions of this film for reasons that we'll get into shortly, but if you're asking me, I think the 2007 version of this film is the slightly better portrayal, and it just so happens to be one of my favourite horror movies of all time, although it does leave out some of the more harrowing scenes depicted in the original, and believe me, that really is saying something. But hey, personal bias aside, Funny Games is one of the greatest psychological horror movies ever made. Period. And the reason that I'm recommending both is that the latter is a shot-for-shot remake from the same filmmaker, the resounding Austrian director Michael Haneke. Now, we could talk about the cultural connotations of this film all day. We could talk about how Funny Games is a stark representation of violence in media, and we could talk about how the whitewashed cinematography perfectly opposes the chaotic nature of modern society, which is remarkably captured in our previous clip, but hey, that's a conversation for a different time. Maybe. For me, the criticism for this film is hilarious. Haneke wrote an entire essay on how his intention for this film was to ultimately serve a pointless narrative. And what were the critics' response? This film is unimaginative and pointless. Yeah, I'll say no more. Written and directed by Michael Haneke, Funny Games tells the tale of a husband and wife alongside their young son who arrive in their lake house for vacation when two young men approach on a small rowing boat and ask to borrow some eggs. That's all I'll say. This film is bleak, this film is horrifying, this film messes with your head, but therein lies the point of it. Also, the way that Funny Games deals with the fourth wall is a breath of fresh air, and it's what elevates this film from senseless violence to a piece of cinema that actually has something to say. Also, in the 2007 version, Michael Pitt, who plays Paul, is phenomenal, and if you're asking me, delivers one of the most remarkable performances in modern horror cinema. Yeah, there we have it. Funny Games. There is nothing funny about it. Watch it. And finally, coming in at the number 1 spot, The Silence of the Lambs, 1991.
Good evening, gentlemen.
The fact of the matter remains, we can't make a list based on psychological horror without giving the top spot to the undisputed king of cerebral horror machinations, Dr. Hannibal Lecter himself. Pound for pound, this is perhaps one of the greatest horror thrillers ever made. Fact. We all know it, there is no denying it. And whilst it's mainly down to the fact that Sir Anthony Hopkins delivers an out-of-this-world performance as one of the most complex characters of horror ever written, it's also down to the fact that The Silence of the Lambs doesn't rely on artistry to bring the psychological horror, but instead, it simply documents it. It plays out the story of Buffalo Bill, Lecter and Clarice Starling, and then it goes. There are no mind-bending assaults of the brain, there is nothing lurking within the cinematography that throws us off guard. It is simply a story and a performance. And for a film to be as impactful as it is without resting on its laurels, we have to take note that there simply aren't many movies like this anymore. Directed by Jonathan Demme and based upon the fantastic novel of the same name by Thomas Harris, The Silence of the Lambs tells the tale of FBI trainee Clarice Starling, who is mysteriously assigned to interview Dr. Hannibal Lecter, a former psychiatrist and imprisoned cannibalistic serial killer whose unique perspective of the human mind is needed to hunt down another psychopathic serial killer, Buffalo Bill, a murderer responsible for killing young women and then skinning them. Listen, there are no places to hide with this film. From the off, we descend into a world of psychological conflict, a world where sharks hunt sharks. But put it this way, despite its horrific content, The Silence of the Lambs is one of the few horror films to win an Academy Award. Not just 1, but 5, including Best Actor, Best Picture, and Best Actress for the phenomenal Jodie Foster. And whilst I usually don't exactly care for the Oscars, this one is as deserving as they come. The Silence of the Lambs is perhaps the finest story of psychological horror ever captured on screen. It's number 1 every single day, and now I wish I would have worn my Silence of the Lambs t-shirt. Damn.